Hello everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome to another Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood video. In this video we'll be talking about what we know about the revamped combat system, which is very little, so we're going to substantiate that with talking about why the revamped combat system likely means a complete phase out of the class system, or at least showcasing that they have completely abandoned the class job system and what it was originally supposed to accomplish. Now keep in mind that while some of this video is taking the facts, we will be speculating based on those facts quite frequently. I'll be sure to distinguish a difference between when we're talking about speculation and fact. So before we can really understand why they're doing what they're doing with the revamped combat system, let's take a look at the history of the class job system in its entirety. When the game originally launched back in 1.0, Final Fantasy XIV was released with only classes. They were unfamiliar to players expecting things like the classic Final Fantasy jobs. It also introduced the cross-class system, which allowed you to borrow skills from other classes and use them on whatever class you were playing, though within some certain limitations. In patch 1.21, jobs were implemented, accessed by having one primary class at level 30 and a subclass at level 15. The jobs that were introduced at this time were White Mage coming out of Conjurer, Black Mage out of Thaumaturge, Paladin out of Gladiator, Warrior out of Marauder, Bard out of Archer, Monk out of Pugilist, and Dragoon out of Lancer. Now on top of needing the class requirements of having the primary class at 30 and a designated subclass at 15, you'd also be required to complete a quest to unlock not only the job, but new skills similar to the way classes worked. The whole point of jobs was to take the general roles that the classes filled and focus them down further for endgame content, giving each job more dedicated tools to perform their party roles. Now by the end of 1.0, classes were still somewhat useful. People found uses for them usually for farming or for doing certain open world content, as well as the occasional cheesy method they could use in endgame content. Then 1.x shut down and a Realm Reborn launched several months later, keeping pieces of the class job system with a few changes. To start, the class job progression remained mostly the same, though a few subclasses required to unlock jobs were changed. You still gained abilities, you still unlocked the jobs via the job quests, and you even obtained some items from these quests. Due to the change in the subclasses, some cross-class abilities were changed. For example, Bard could no longer access Conjurer skills like it could back in 1.x. Where problems began with the class system first showed when they introduced the new class to a Realm Reborn, Arcanist. From the Arcanist class, you could split into two jobs, Summoner or Scholar. This one class splits into two job thing is really where the struggle to balance the class job system began. For one, you were able to place bonus attributes into any of the 6 main stats in the game. But for Arcanist, you could only do this once, regardless of whether or not you were swapping between Summoner and Scholar often. Maybe you're playing Summoner today, hey, I have 30 points in Intelligence. Do you want to switch to 30 points of Mind and go play Scholar? Well, you're going to need to go buy an item and swap those points. This was the only class to have this issue, and it was simply because it had two jobs branching out of a single class. One of the other issues with this was that by leveling either one of these two jobs to 50, you automatically had the other one at 50 because you were actually leveling the class and equipping your job stone. What this led to was a lot of players basically having a max level job they had no idea how to play and what skills it used and how they worked together. On top of that, balancing the two jobs became an issue. If they wanted to buff Summoner, they had to be careful. They couldn't just buff the Arcanist skills that Summoner was using as the core of its kit, as then it would also be a buff to Scholar instead. This meant that they had to either be careful with class changes or only make changes to the job skills. Arcanist also had the annoyance of being a class that was a DPS only. Basically, if you wanted to play Scholar, you were still forced to play Arcanist as a DPS for the first 30 levels, before you could eventually become a healer after unlocking the Scholar job. It wasn't too long into the game's cycle that the developers admitted that this was a bit of a mistake. The whole one class becomes two job things was inefficient and hard to work with for the development team for all the reasons above. At that point, we pretty much accepted they'll never do this again. But Arcanist wasn't the only class that had issues, and not Scholar and Summoner only either. Other jobs saw issues with the cross-class system as well. The biggest complaint from the player base was that players were forced to level classes for mandatory cross-class skills. While the system was initially presented as a means to provide some choice for players for different scenarios, it ultimately became a matter of which 4 cross-class skills were mandatory and maybe one final one that was debatable. Now keep in mind when we say mandatory, that mostly means for endgame content. Things like Warrior being a tank that doesn't have Provoke and needing to level Gladiator to get that skill. It's odd since content was designed with tank swaps built into the game, and the only tool to utilize it was baked into Gladiator, forcing players that maybe weren't interested in the Gladiator class to go out of their way to get that and other skills. It also just straight up created confusion as to what the point of classes were in the first place. The dev team boasted that while jobs were meant for endgame content, the additional cross-class slots you gained while being a class would be useful for customizing gameplay outside of Dungeon. Unfortunately, this game was not built around you doing things as classes at all, and it phased them out entirely once you could obtain your jobs. Now, I know there were some niche scenarios where people used classes. For example, I remember when PvP was first released, Marauder was really popular over Warrior for its higher damage output, and I saw plenty of archers in front lines when that was released. Swiftcast Stoneskin, yo. That doesn't change the fact that pretty much the entire game was already beginning to move things towards jobs, and classes just seemed like a weird system. Now in 2.4, they released another class job combination, Rogue and Ninja. Now Rogue was a new class into the game, however it offered nothing new to the cross-class system. Some of its ability could be used by other classes, such as Goad being used by Gladiator and Marauder, but it's not like Paladin and Warrior could use them, and none of the existing jobs could use any of Rogue's skills cross-class. And on top of that, Ninja didn't get any interesting cross-class choices either. It simply pulled from the same pre-existing group of what were considered mandatory cross-class skills from the other two melee DPS. It was offered and had to utilize the exact same choices. So that goes on and things aren't getting any better, and then 3.0 was released. This was the first time they really showed abandonment towards the class system. No additions were made to classes, and 3 new jobs were released: Dark Knight, Machinist, and Astrologian. Now while these 3 jobs still utilize the cross-class systems from the existing skills that were available prior to the expansion, they themselves had no base class. You unlock the jobs and they immediately began at level 30, the level where base classes originally unlocked their jobs back at Realm Reborn. Oh, and by the way, still no use of the Rogue cross-class skills. On top of that, none of these jobs shared any of their skills with the other jobs. Now if all of that didn't basically point towards them leaving the class system in the dust, with the launch of a new expansion and 5 new abilities for all the jobs, hotbars began to get really bloated and complex. This was even compounded more by the use of PvP unique skills. Now I know that's a lot of history, but it all comes down to this. At the North American Fan Festival in Las Vegas, they announced a revamped battle system to help tone down the game's combat while still keeping it exciting. Now the exact details of everything this involves is unknown, but we do know a few things here and there. The first bit of information they released is that the cross-class system is going away and are instead being replaced with role-specific skills. Basically, what we think this means is that skills that are considered mandatory for certain roles will be thrown into a pool of skills and removed from the classes that they were native to. For example, Provoke is considered mandatory for tanks, so it would fall into this role category as a tank ability, as opposed to being a gladiator-specific skill. What this likely means is that you won't need to level additional classes for cross-class skills anymore. That's still a little bit of speculation there, but we also don't know what this means for traits that were attached to previous cross-class skills. Technically, the ability is still available for said class, so it's likely that it remains the same. There is also the chance that the entirety of the other skills are revamped and the way traits are done is revamped, so again, speculation at this point. Additionally, they noted that less useful skills are going to be re-evaluated. What that means again, we don't know. It can mean they're removed, it could mean they're reworked, we'll have to wait and find out. And finally, the last thing we know is that the goal of this revamp is to allow them to add new skills in the expansion, but not just add even more buttons for jobs to use in their rotation. This goal has been talked about in a lot of recent live letters, as they want the jobs to be, quote, easier to play, unquote, so that they can make more difficult raids and not have players need to be so focused on the performance of their job to the point where they need to neglect the mechanics of an encounter. They felt that they really did make jobs way too difficult while also increasing the difficulty of the raids, compounding the difficulty of properly playing one's job and performing in endgame content. It pretty much was part of the reason that the raiding community was destroyed, looking at you A3 Savage, and it created far too large of a player skill gap in the community. What this means overall is we should be pressing less buttons than we do now to perform our jobs, despite even more skills being added. Now, other than that, we have almost no information, and we probably won't until the next fan festival. Some speculate that maybe we'll get a faster global cooldown and cast times. Some speculate that skill combos will be condensed into a single button, for example, Fast Blade, Savage Blade, and Rage of Halone, all being one button. How and what they do, we still don't know. I'm a favor of that one in particular, though. We also know that stats are going to be reworked, parry being one of the main ones, but they're doing that with the other stats too, so again, speculation. While this isn't as important of a detail, it is also worth mentioning that Encyclopedia Eorzea does mention class guilds, but it goes into very little detail on them, while giving jobs full-blown pages with all the details you could want. So what does this mean? I've got a lot of questions. Why don't they just do this? Why don't they do that? They did this before. So let's talk about that. Does this mean we won't see anything like the Summoner Scholar job split anymore? Probably. I mean, based on what we said about the job split even before we talked about 3.0, they showed great disinterest in making multiple jobs branch off of the same class. On top of that, with the changes that they're doing to additional skills, it looks like they're really trying to move away from this class job system that 1.0 really developed for the game. So for those of you hoping that Dancer, based on the trailer, is going to be branching off a pugilist, sorry, probably won't happen. Another question I get is, does this mean they're going to remove classes in 4.0? I don't think they'll flat out remove them, because there's a lot of work that goes into then taking the lore of the jobs and making it make sense at level 1. It's kind of like Eorzea's very unfocused means of training new adventurers. I mean, I feel like it has an okay place there. But what they probably will do is pretty much move all of their systems after you unlock jobs as far away from the classes as possible. Another question I've gotten is, how do you know they're doing any of this? How do we know that classes are being phased out like that? How do we know that they don't like the class system? How do we know these things? It just comes from years and years and years of playing the game and paying attention to the live letters and whatnot. I know a lot of people join the game in Heaven's Ward or after certain live letters, and it's not easy to keep up with every single live letter. I'm not going to go tell someone who starts playing in 3.4 to go watch all the live letters so I don't have to answer a question, or so they're completely informed about everything that's been said about the game. It's an unreasonable thing to expect, and that's why we do see a lot of confusion or a lot of suggestions that really do go towards these directions. To those people, I'm just glad you're playing and enjoying the game, and I know it's a lot of information to keep up with, so thank you for paying attention to the things I've had to tell you in this video. If you're looking for any more videos regarding the class and job changes and what some other people might think of it, I highly recommend checking out Del Monte's video. He's a member of the Gamer Escape team. He talks about his thoughts and if we'll see a removal of the class system entirely, something I don't think we'll see, but his side of it is quite interesting. Overall, I think the class system, it's dated, probably never going to be used again, and the further away they move from it, the happier I'll be. That's not a pun on my name, I promise. So tell me, what do you think they'll be doing with this revamped combat system? Are you hoping for a shorter global cooldown? Are you hoping for some decent changes to the additional skill system? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more information and speculation on Final Fantasy XIV's next expansion, Stormblood. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.